Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's ERA Live session. This will be our last ERA Live for 2023. Today, we will be providing you with an update regarding the ERA Electronic Components Industry Trends Survey. This monthly members-only survey launched by ERA in June of this year focuses on valuable industry intelligence. During today's discussion, you'll hear about critical data that's been collected to date from the survey, with a summarization of trends from the latter half of 2023, along with an outlook for early 2024. ERA CEO Walter Tobin will facilitate today's discussion and will introduce our special guest speaker. But before we get started, I'd like to remind all of you to please keep your devices on mute, but questions are encouraged. So if you would like to ask a question, please utilize the chat box or the raise hand function. Walter, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Before we get started with Dennis, I wanted to share some bad news with all of our attendees on the call. Chuck Tanzola, who is the president of ERA Executive Board, passed away last Thursday night. Those of you that knew Chuck loved him. Those of you who were on these water cooler calls, these ERA Live calls with him, you knew that there was a lot of good banter between myself and Chuck about his Argyle sweaters and about his alleged graduation from Cornell, which he did graduate from. And I would always sort of lovingly pick on Chuck because I loved him. He passed away Thursday night. Some of us will be heading up to the Ithaca area on Sunday for his service, Sunday afternoon and Monday. So, during the holidays, please keep his family in your prayers. And, we all talk about how precious life is and how sometimes, you never know when you're going to get bad news. So hug your family, be kind to each other, and just think of Chuck during the holidays. So I wanted to share that news with you, and God rest his soul. We are delighted to have Dennis Reed once again as part of ERA. Those of you that I think everybody knows Dennis in the industry. He's a senior analyst with Edgewater Research. He's been very, very visible at the ERA conferences. He's spoken at a couple of other industry conferences. He's been very visible both in person and on Zoom at many different ERA chapter events. He is just really a very smart individual. He's going to talk about a couple of things. He's going to talk about the ERA survey, which we started in July, which we did to really give our members an additional benefit to the membership of ERA, and that is having some real tangible live data on how the market's doing, how the industry's doing, how you're doing. We've had over 100 respondents so far. Every one of the member companies of ERA gets this survey. If you don't know who's getting it in your company, we can tell you who we're sending it to. Sometimes we're sending it to the wrong person. Might be the owner of a company that really may not be the person that we want to fill it out. So we'd like to get more people to fill it out, because the more people we get on the survey, the more valuable the information is to all of you. So Dennis is going to talk about our survey and then how that dovetails with the bigger picture of what he sees in all of his other research as part of Edgewater Research. So we timed this for December. There's a lot of you are beginning to or finishing up plans for 2024. So we're really delighted that Dennis is appearing today. He also will be presenting at the ERA conference in February. We'll be doing 2 breakout sessions. So without further ado, let me welcome Dennis Reed, Senior Analyst of Edgewater Research. Dennis?
Thank you very much, Walter, and thank you everybody else for attending. Much like Walter had mentioned, the passing of Chuck is very hard for myself, because I look at the great relationship that's building between Edgewater and its members and ERA, and I could unequivocally say 100% of that is really tied to Chuck's efforts in introduction. So with a heavy heart around the holidays, thank you everybody for having me. As Walter mentioned, we'll really cover a couple of things here, starting with survey mechanics, if you will. So I'll just kind of walk everybody through, how the survey operates, what it looks like. Again, just trying to help everyone who may not have participated have some awareness. After that, quick intro to Edgewater. I won't spend too much time on that. And then most importantly, we'll dig into the results in how they dovetail into what we're seeing at the bigger, broader, kind of more macro level. So, a ton of info to cover here. And again, just really appreciate the opportunity for everybody to spend some time with you today. So without further ado, just to start from a mechanical standpoint, to remind everybody, our survey is done in a partnership. It is conducted monthly in a partnership between the ERA and Edgewater, at the sponsorship, of course, in the direction of ERA and the national organization, and really facilitated through Edgewater's backend system, which when we get to the end, I'll talk a little bit more while that's important. But we conduct it monthly. So really the first notification most people will see is on the first of every month. And you will see 2 additional reminders effectively between the 1st and 15th of the month, reminding you to complete the system. After that 15th is eclipsed, it's typically a day or 2 turnaround time for the results. And then the results are published behind the member or the paywall. I don't know the official term, but the membership section of the ERA website. So it is just for the membership, at the benefit of the membership. And the more participation we get, I can't echo this enough, the more participation we get, the more credence it comes to the survey itself. And for those, and I understand security risks and everything else. Unfortunately, we don't have a better email than the one listed here as the no reply at mail.client.edgewaterresearch.com. But that's the email to be looking for, or the email address, I should say, to be looking for. And shifting over to the next side, just so everybody knows, and I know this is a touch small, but I tried to do my best to screen call or to screenshot what the email looks like for the survey. So, rest assured, when you see the blue banner with Edgewater and the ERA logo and the survey access link, this is not spam. It is not a phishing campaign. This is not an IT risk. This is sanctioned by by ERA via Edgewater system, and it's a reliable source. And again, for the membership on here, Walter, myself, Aaron, the team, we had, there are agreements in place. There's nobody's individual information that's shared. There's nobody's individual information that we could pull. So there is a level of data security and anonymity, if you will, when you go through the process. So, that's some of the mechanics to start. Just a quick background on who we are at Edgewater. And I'll cover this quick, but we're an independent research company. We focus on technology, internet, consumer. Over 50% of our business, we work with the largest money managers in the world. We provide critical business insight through what we call fundamental research. And we've been doing this for a long time. Our reputation across companies dates back over 2 decades. Collectively on our hard technology team, we have north of, I think, 60 years experience. So we've been at this for a while. And then why Edgewater, deeply connected in the industry. I think everybody, through our various engagements, the national chapter, local chapters, I think that's probably apparent, but we live and breathe in the supply chain in the industry. As I mentioned, trusted resource for the investment community. But likewise, we also work with our industry customers, helping them shape strategies in terms of where the market is going. To Walter's point, if you have questions on the survey, and I know we'll make this slide deck available to everybody, and I'll get it over to Aaron and the team's hands after the presentation. Questions on the survey, questions on anything else, you could scan the QR code right now, which will have my contact info. If not, it's in the deck. Please reach out, survey, questions, you name it. We're happy to be partnered together. We're thrilled to be partnered together. And again, the more that we can have, the more interaction that we can have and the more participation, the better the results will be. So, now that the housekeeping side, excuse me, is done, now on to the exciting side here. So this is the ERA sales survey growth. And it's exciting for a couple of reasons, because one, we're starting to get critical mass. We have 5 months worth of data. This will continue to be more relevant and important as we go forward, right? So the more months help. And then ultimately, the more inflections that we get when the data switches positive, because unfortunately, as we know, right now we're in a touch of a downturn. But a couple of questions around it. In the one area that really jumps out to me when I looked at the actual data behind this is how much price has still mattered in the industry as we've worked from June, July, August, and ultimately the October results. When you look at the actual implied volume growth in August, September, and October, we were looking at volumes down somewhere in that, call it 6 to 7% range. And as you can see, the overall sales environment is down somewhere in that 5 to 7% range. So I think a couple of things that jump out. One, that 5 to 7% range, while these are monthly numbers, these are very much in line with what we're seeing, across, I would say, the national average. And we do know the ERA membership skews more to the Americas versus the rest of the world. But, when we look at the overall industry this year for the Americas in particular, and I'll touch on that as we get later, but we're thinking about the Americas, again, somewhere down in that mid-single digit range. And, for those on the call, I would tell you, this, I think, is proof to us in a very, very short window, right? Couple of months here. But this is proof that these results very much are mimicking the reality of what's going on in the broader world. So, that's good news and something to be celebrated across the membership, that the results, we would deem as quote unquote accurate as to what you're seeing in across the industry. Fortunately, from a bad news side, we all ultimately know we're in the midst of an inventory correction, and we'll talk about the supply side in a little bit. So again, sales have been trending on a monthly basis down 4 to 5%. As we dig into markets, I would tell you, and I would ascribe to a bulk of this is really inventory digestion driven. As we shift from shipments to bookings, again, I think the thing that jumps out to me is we've looked at a book-to-bill ratio that's been hovering in that, call it 0.8 range for an average, so definitely below 1. For those of you that have seen our broader work, that admittedly is a much more qualitative look than what we have with the actual data here. This very much sinks and gives us comfort again that what we're seeing from a survey result very much is indicative of the broader market. And again, as I talk about it, and we think about it going forward, so that's definitely a good news. But again, the bad news is we are in a constrained or a challenging bookings environment as the end customers, as distributors continue to work through inventory. Another item that notes to me is really, when we think of, have we seen the worst, right? Have we seen the worst of this bookings environment? Have we seen the worst of the sales environment? And, at the end of the day, what jumps out to me is we look at almost a 9.5% year-over-year decline in bookings in September. And then again, a sharp rebound as we went into October here. It gives me some comfort that I think, we might have hit that provisional quote unquote washing out period. I think September, from an overall booking standpoint, might prove, to be the bottom, if you will, which is, again, good news as you start thinking about your business in 24 and beyond. Again, the challenge with it as we dig through additional supplies, we're still working through clearly inventory, and the supply availabilities, much, much more available than it has been in recent years. So again, we think the bookings may have bottomed. And you continue to see improvements going forward. But again, I think in aggregate, we look at the overall bookings environment exiting this year and probably through the first half of next year is somewhat in that sub 1 book to bill range. And again, a focus more on kind of turns orders and cleaning up inventory versus really placing any extended backlog on anybody in the supply chain. Shifting over to the backlog side, and again, I think there's some really interesting and telling information here, and we look at a bunch of different things on here, but to me, the backlog trend overall, and I think this echoes a lot what I said on the previous slide. When you look at the backlog trend net, we were at a net 50% of all respondents in the month of September, saying that their backlog was shrinking. My gut tells me, especially with that sharp rebound in October, my backlog, or my gut tells me that, September again could prove to be the quote unquote bottom for us. I do think there's some level of math involved here naturally, right? When we think back to the high water mark of the cycle in the industry, the cycle actually peaked in October of 2022. So again, you run into a little bit of comparison benefit there that makes the year over year numbers maybe look a little bit better. But again, I think this is a good sign to say that, hey, we might have taken the excess in terms of bookings, the double orders, things like that. We may have finally gotten to the point in the supply chain where, most of those adjustments are behind us. And again, what does that set us up for going forward? It sets us up for an environment where we've got to clean the inventory, which we all know after being in the business means we'll overshoot on that side as well. But it means, we've got to get the inventory back in order, which we think is another kind of 3 to 6 months. And then we'll start shipping to consumption and go from there. So again, to prove the point that this has been very, very accurate, I want to switch from the ERA results to what we've seen for the broader, semiconductor industry. And the reason that at least we use the semi side is our good friends at the SIA, publish data on a monthly basis. So, if you think back to the ERA slide, we saw sales in the down again, 5 to 7% environment. And when we compare this to the October 22 peak, so the bold red line, as you can see in there, the sales actually bottomed at a down 10% number. Now, it's important to say, because the first question I'm sure is, well, Dennis, you said 5 to 7, and this industry is showing down 10, it's much worse. It's important to note that those down 10 numbers were in March and April before we had the survey going, and we've seen some improvements that have put them more in line with our results. So again, when I'm looking at this just from an analytical lens, and does this pass, quote unquote, the sniff test on is this accurate? I think kudos to everybody on the call, kudos to those who have participated on the survey, and not that this is a surprise, but this is a very, very valuable tool that is real-time monthly insights into what's going on for the membership, of course, but more importantly, it seems highly accurate to date with what we've seen in the big, in the broader, more macro level of the industry. So again, gives us confidence when we look at the results from the survey that they mirror what we've seen in the industry. And then again, going forward, I would say when we look at this side, and I've talked about this slide, I'm sure, to a number of people here, our outlook going forward, and we'll talk some numbers later, we do give credence to that this will be, somewhat of a quote unquote shallow bottom, if you will. So we don't think it's a 2000 correction. We don't think it's an 07 correction. We do think it's kind of a shallow correction. So as we start planning our business into next year, we are looking for some growth next year. It'll be more back half, second half weighted than the first half. But again, we do think the worst is behind us, but we also, I would caution to say, there's varying ways that you can measure this, right? So we think we don't probably get back to peak sales on a monthly basis, probably until late 3Q, early 4Q next year. But again, in general, we think it's setting up for kind of a transition year back to growth next year. As we shift back to the survey, also I think some relatively powerful tools here, and then we'll look higher level at some of the macro industry data here. But we're looking at both the October and the September results. So I'll just focus on where we've seen strength, right? We've seen strength in the aerospace, in the medical markets. And for those that have heard me speak in the past, medical, I think, unfortunately, we all know you've got a demographic in play, trend in play really across the world. One. Two, we've just got a digitalization of healthcare. You could also lump in at-home monitoring and things like that. So, medical, I think, makes a lot of sense. When you look at the aerospace and defense outperformance, I think that also makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, the world has been grappling with the Ukraine-Russia conflict for going on, I think, 3 years, really starting at, January of next year. And then, of course, more recently, the tragic events unfolding in Israel and the Middle East. I think when you think of that with the results and the outperformance of aerospace, and I would put aerospace and defense together in that. This survey for October was conducted, during those first 15 days of October. So obviously the news with the attack on Israel was probably fresh in everybody's mind. So I don't know if the delta or the sharp increase, in October relative to September, I think that might be a little quote unquote media bias, if you will. But I do think it's important to note that the aerospace and defense market has been one of the more robust. And then likely, we'll talk through, industrial, which was still kind of in the flat to positive range in September, continues to moderate. Again, we've talked about inventory, and I'll hit big picture on inventory in a few slides. But, to us, industrial, there's nothing really fundamentally wrong with demand at a high level from an industrial standpoint. The only quote unquote problem with industrials, there's just too much inventory there, in particular in distribution. And then likewise in the automotive section, again, relative outperformance in automotive, that did moderate as we got into October. I think some of that moderation in October is probably very much a reality of what we've seen going on with the UAW strike that was ongoing at the time. That was kind of peak or in the middle of the UAW strike. So again, covered the top 4 or 5 markets. And I think really to us, the punchline is they make sense, right? Based on what you've seen going on. And when you look at some of those moderations, in particular, in the automotive space, the scale back in October very much coincide with what we've seen in some of our other work where, yes, we had the Detroit OEMs ordering, but we had production displays, we had inventory building, et cetera. So it was kind of a messy period. And we did start to see some pausing of orders and some inventory shuffling in automotive starting in October. So again, I think it gives us kudos and credibility for those of us on the call. When you're looking at this as a tool real time to measure your business, the results that we've seen 4 or 5 months in have been accurate. To reinforce the accuracy, so I'm going to take a step back here for the next 4 or 5 slides. We're going to look much more at a macro level here. So this is total vehicle sales in the U.S. and again, think back to the previous slide in what you saw in automotive. So to us, automotive in the U.S. is very much kind of a good news, bad news scenario. From a good news standpoint, on Jan 1 of this year, the forecast was about 15.5 million units for the SAR, with 17 days left, I think, or 18 days left in the year. That forecast is held. So that's good news. So we're still looking at, a 15.5-ish or so million unit number for the US. So very much good news there. The bad news side of that's kind of the makeup in the inventory side of it. So dealer inventory levels have been replenished through that. The SAR this year was primarily driven by fleet vehicles. Fleet vehicles traditionally and continue to hold a kind of lower mix, more standard feature, so a little bit less electrified, if you will, purchase. So we do think that's playing out where years past we've had unit downside with mix upside as all the OEMs have effectively put us on allocation. This year we had more of a an inventory kind of headwind going into next year, a more muted mix with reasonable auto. So, as we shift this, more importantly, of course, with 18 days, what does this look like next year? We're hearing and thinking that the SAR for next year again is probably in that 15.5 million unit range. So we're thinking, roughly flattish year over year for 2024. And honestly, with all things considered, between interest rates, elevated inventory levels, things of that nature, I actually think that's pretty good. So we're thinking, kind of 15.5 million is the right number for there. If you want to go upside, kind of downside to it, admittedly don't see, for range of outcomes, we don't see a ton of quote unquote upside probably to that number with interest rates and things like that. But the flip side, we think the downside's pretty limited. So if there's a certain portion, again, all else equal, we don't fall off a cliff, there's no financial crisis, things like that. We think there's probably maybe 1 million or so units at risk. So worst case scenario, we probably go back to that 2022 level. But again, we think 15.5 is pretty fair right now. As we shift from auto and we look at the industrial marketplace, again, think about that moderation and look at kind of where that year over year number is gone. So, the good news, which again bucks the trend a little bit of what we've seen in our survey, and I think that could be pointed to just order timing, start a quarter versus end a quarter, some of that financial window dressing that might go on in distribution or end customer level. But again, when you look at in a general sense, we are past, peak in terms of overall manufacturing in the US. We did dip slightly negative year over year at the midpoint of this year before recovering to kind of flattish. So, I think, again, when we think about, the industrial market on our industry slide that was in that flat to slight growth marketplace, we align this up with the manufacturing data that we're seeing at the high level. Again, number one, it makes sense to us. I think it gives a lot of credibility in the data. But two, and more importantly, when we think about it going forward, I would tell everybody there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the industrial business. If we were to assume this high level overall manufacturing number is kind of flattish through 2024, barring the inventory correction, which will be ongoing through the first half of the year, but barring that correction, we would still expect, a couple of points outperformance, call it 4 or 5% outperformance based on electrification, automation, things like that. The catch for next year, again, is we do think there's an inventory overhang that's probably going to last through, call it the second quarter of the year. So when we're thinking about that industrial business kind of bogey, for next year, a number for next year, we're thinking somewhere in that kind of low single digit. Again, work through the inventory in the first half of the year, return back to growth in the second half of the year. For the last slide, and again, think about the strength that we've seen, in our survey results with the aerospace and defense marketplace. I think it aligns with what we've seen in kind of these two charts. Book to bill has been in the last couple of months, the 1.1, 1.12, 1.15 range. So again, above 1, which is kind of the only marketplace that's really been above 1. And then when you think from a shipment standpoint, we've been in that 10% growth range, which is great. But again, when I look at it longer term, what I would caution people is, yes, and again, not making light of the humanitarian crisis in the Middle East or the Ukraine or anything like that. But when you look at defense spending overall, we've been in a long-term secular increase. And equally as important to that secular increase is what the money's being spent on. So really, if you dig through Pentagon budgets, I would argue there's been relatively nominal changes with the two most recent conflicts going on globally. This spend is really being allocated to the war of the future. And unfortunately, the war of the future is largely believed to be fought over the Pacific. It's believed to be fought via cyber warfare, via hypersonic missiles. So it's a much more of a trend of kind of digitalizing our defense infrastructure. So, and I think that's kind of playing through why you see relative outperformance, again, in the defense markets here near term. As we shift from the macro view and we look, at the inventory, or I'm sorry, as we look back to the survey view, we'll also shift gears here a little bit and look at the supply side of the equation. And again, roughly halfway through the presentation, I don't know how many times I've said we don't have a demand issue, we simply have an inventory issue. But I think what we're seeing kind of touches, on that, very, very well. When you look at the customer level, too high. When you look at the passive level, it's too high. Interconnects are too high, and semis are viewed, kind of adequate, ish. This to us makes sense, and I think there's a couple of other things that are important. So one, from a passive standpoint, good, better, and different with passives. We do know they are high-tech devices, but there is more interchangeability, there's more competition, they are subject more to pricing pressures, and then subsequently their inventory and their lead times started to correct earlier, and they're still working through. So, the passives to us, when we dig into kind of the outlook at the end, that's the area we see the most concern. Admittedly, I'm a little surprised looking at October that the interconnect inventory is viewed as a little bit more problematic than the semi inventory. Our gut in our qualitative work seems like interconnect has made a little bit more progress. But what I would tell you is the semis were obviously leaner and the lead times were much more extended than the interconnect was. So I think as we shift forward into the November results and then ultimately the December results, yeah, I would expect the semi side again to look a little bit more on the higher side than the interconnect side. But in general, again, when you look at inventory overall, it's still viewed as too high. I think the last thing that's important, and this is always, the big mystery and really I would say the value to everybody here. When you think of ERA conceptually, we're talking 600 plus organizations that are ultimately the boots on the ground carrying the bag to see the customers, right? Nobody from your largest analog supplier who does not use distribution down in the supply chain. When you have those conversations with their executive suite, they are very, very candid that once their product leaves either their shelf and or their distributor's shelf, they have zero control or clue what the inventory levels are. And again, we've got 600 members. In a perfect world, we'd have 100% participation. But we've got a good participation rate here who has access and visibility into that. So that customer inventory read, I would tell everybody on the call, is very, very unique to you guys as a membership, and is something that hopefully is a valuable tool for you as you think about your business months in, quarters in, years in, et cetera. As we marry what we saw, with what the big picture macro level is, again, is this accurate? And my answer is, when we look at the 264 billion, to round it off, dollars worth of inventory globally across analog, compute suppliers, comm suppliers, distribution, ODMs, OEMs, et cetera. I think we're onto something here. And there's a couple of things that jump out. So again, when you look at dollars, and those that have seen a similar chart out of me, the good news is we finally found some religion and have made some progress on the supply chain. So we've started to burn some dollars. That's a good news. I think on the days basis, which is more importantly, we finally, call it flat to slightly down year over year. But again, sharp sequential or quarter over quarter decline. So, what we're seeing with there being too much inventory is you stack that days of inventory versus 2019, which is boxed in red. I think that tells the exact story of what we're seeing in our survey here. Total inventory is 34% higher than what it was in 3Q19, or the last quarter that was quote unquote normal. And again, when you think, excuse me, when you think back to the previous chart, I think that aligns with a lot of our results. So again, inventory, not to beat a dead horse, but I will. We don't have a demand problem here. We simply got too much product. And again, our survey is showing that, and we're also seeing it in terms of the data reported by the big suppliers and distributors and the likes of that. Along with the inventory, we'll talk about lead times. And again, I would tell everybody, everybody on the call, when you're thinking about information vacuums in the supply chain, this is one of them, right? Nobody has a great sense of lead times in the inventory. And while I would be the first to admit every supplier is unique, different, etc., right? I think this is pretty helpful and pretty telling to look at it, as we go through from a passive and interconnect and a semi side. So what's interesting to me, and again, not a lot actually jumps out, because I think we all know that lead times are down, and they've been down since we started the survey. But I think when we go forward, more importantly, is we know when the lead times get above that 26-week range, that's when we start running into problems, much less when they extend to 50. So I think the goal by doing this monthly is to make it repeatable, and again, ultimately be able to have a signal on when we're entering in a shortage situation, which for anybody on the call might give you another, some fodder to talk to your customers and show your industry knowledge that's being generated by your peers in the ERA. So with that, I'll shift to kind of the outlook. And again, and how did we get there before the outlook? We simply spent too much money, and I think everybody's heard me deliver this slide or some version of it. 2020, 2021, 2022, we had double-digit growth, year-over-year growth in capital spending for the industry. The only other time in the history we've had that happen 3 years in a row was 98, 99, 2000. We know how that ended. So unfortunately for us in the industry, we can't help ourselves. It gets tight. This time's always different, and we spend money like drunken sailors to only find out that people double booked and there will be excess capacity. I would say please bear in mind that when you look at sales over the long term, it's a relatively linear line up until the right. The capacity metric is much more of a step function. So while we've overspent, we'll ultimately grow into it. But again, what we see here, I think, is really reflective of the lead times, and we'll see how it goes going forward. So to wrap up, again, before some simple reminders, what does this all mean? So, we've got this year down 12, including memory. If you strip the memory side out, it's closer to down 5. More importantly, what does it mean for next year? So I think I had mentioned earlier, when we think of semis in the industry overall, and I'll touch on the numbers for interconnects and passives in the next few slides, I would classify 2024 as a transition year. 21 was the start of the shortage, 20 was the start of the shortage, 20 was heavy shortage, 21 heavy shortage, 22 heavy shortage. I may have said one extra year there. 23 was obviously our correction year. When we think about next year, ex memory, we're thinking somewhere in the 2 to 3% growth numbers. So again, low single digits, probably down in the first half of the year, but working ourselves back into positive in the second half of the year before transitioning back to what we think is the more long-term 6 to 8% growth for the semi industry. So again, would put next year as a transition back to normal. And I'd be very important to say, to us, there is no new normal. Old normal is probably normal, but, we think this is kind of a transition year. But again, the worst is ultimately behind us in 23. Very, very similar story when we look to the interconnect market. I would tell you the only delta, we've got interconnects up kind of 1 to 2 for next year. And then, we're thinking more the 5 to 6 versus 6 to 8 for the long-term growth for the interconnect market. The delta between the two, I would tell you, is really just the ASP difference. Within the semi space, new product introductions tend to boost ASPs more more likely than they do in the interconnect. They tend to not get the premium as much. So that's kind of the point or two delta. When we look to the interconnect side, we think electrification of vehicles, we think factory automation, we think AI. So again, good solid demand drivers to drive mid-single digit growth. And then lastly, just on the passive side, most conservative forecasts, I would say, to ramp the year, the last 18 months. But, more importantly, we think next year's flat. And I would tell you, of all the three big picture categories that we cover, this is the one that we're most concerned on. And really the delta is price. In our work, in our conversations, pricing has still been benign, despite where we are in the quote unquote cycle. Passives are the one area where there seems to be an increasing willingness to play ball on price. One, two, in China, which we don't see as a huge threat for some of the domestic Chinese suppliers. The government, we've heard recently, is starting to subsidize factories to ramp production while there's still an elevated inventory. So again, that just, while we don't see that as a huge lift and competitive threat per se to the States in the Western world, increased pricing pressure in China, we think would be felt here. So again, that's the reason for the moderation, but that's also, I would say, when we look at those three markets, the one where we're the most concerned. So to wrap up, I've said this a couple of times, please, 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 please participate. The broader our participation, the more accurate, the more impactful, the more helpful this survey will be for you guys. We have 600 plus members. The boots on the ground cliche. I hope I've unlocked a lot of truths here that it very much mirrors the broader industry with some unique insights that obviously we could unlock only for our membership. And then again, when you think bigger picture, this is also creating and some things that we could potentially work down the road for your company's benchmarking versus results, sales growth, things like that. So, there's more stuff that we could build into the backbone of this going forward as we enhance the partnership. But all of those things really run amok if we don't have the membership. So please, please, please participate. And then secondly, and I will say from a regional differentiation standpoint, I have been blessed and fortunate to engage with a number of the regional local chapters with everybody here. And the number one question I get is, Dennis, this is great. What does this mean for region ABC or 1, 2, 3? And in our core product, you guys in the rep world are much more experts at a certain territory where we're much more macro. But the way we have this system built at Edgewater, we can customize this down to the regional level. Now, if I am brought just in honor of Mr. Tanzola, if I am in upstate New York at Ravenwood next year, and I happen to only see one company in upstate, I can't consciously just show upstate results at the DTAM meeting. However, if we've got a broad view and a broad sample, we could take an excellent DTAM presentation that ends as of December 31st, and we could have data that is at the regional level that goes January, February, potentially March. So I'm willing to partner with the regional chapters. I would love to make this local. For us to make this more local, we need your help. So with that, I'll pause. What question do you guys have? I know I covered a ton and probably talked way too much.
Aaron, do we have any questions on the chat room?
Yes, we have a question from Bruce. Bruce, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Dennis your question?
Dennis, my question deals primarily with the automotive market numbers that you have accumulated. When you look at those numbers, do you look at the impact with internal combustion engines compared to BEVs, PHEVs? And if you do you also look at the peripheral market for chargers and the requirements to upgrade the electrical system?
Bruce, great question. And 100% we did. And admittedly, I did not go that deep into it for the context of this ERA live session. I wanted to keep it I wanted to keep it more to the results and some of the value there and kind of high level messages. So we do, and I could dig into that, a little bit more deeply. But I would tell you, I think 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago at the conference in Austin, gave a presentation that really went deep into EV, big picture, long-term, um, forecast for EV that amounted to something of, call it 54, I think, million units by 2040, 33 million, 2030. We stand by those forecasts overall. And when you think about those, under the guise of what would global production need to be to have a 55 million unit number in 2040, we'd probably have to get back to that 95 million. So I think you'd probably top out somewhere, maybe call it 50-ish%. And then, what I think ultimately you're going to see, and I think you're seeing this very, very near term and very, very real time right now. The harsh reality is there's two OEMs that matter right now in terms of the EV marketplace. There's one in the West that's headquartered in Austin. There's one in China. And when you think about, we'll leave why the China one is successful because they've got government backing and they're going to ship units regardless, even if they have to throw them in the ocean. When you look fundamentally at the one here in the West, they've got a couple of, I think, key advantages relative to everybody else chasing. And it's not to say they're going to have 100% share forever, but A, they were first to market, which is important. B, if you remember during the Obama administration, that OEM almost went bankrupt trying to reinvent how you built a car. So they have inherent intellectual property with their manufacturing process. They have battery technologies. And then one of their stated missions is they just build really cool cars that people want to buy, right? That happens to, quote unquote, do good for the world. But I think, there's 3 or 4 things that are really important for that industry leader. And when you look to some of the smaller ones who are chasing here in the West, if you're a traditional internal combustion engine, I firmly believe they tried to jump from an ICE engine right to an EV engine without retooling manufacturing, trying to build cars the same way under heavy scrutiny of the union, and it just doesn't work. And then unfortunately, in particular for the guys in Detroit, when you very, very critically look at some of their financial troubles over the decades, they really stem from the fact that they build cars people don't want to buy. And unfortunately, right now, as it relates to EV, they're building cars that people don't want to buy. So I think, we're in this phase right now where, again, I don't think that leader is going to maintain, 92% market share in the US that they have right now. I think that's unreasonable to think. But I think we're in that phase where some of those smaller venture capital, cash poor shipping 10,000 unit vehicles without much intellectual property trying to build a brand, I think we'll see some level of rationalization, if you will, with some of those companies. And what'll emerge from it, and I think you could draw a lot of parallels with kind of every new emerging technology. You get through the hype cycle, you get the rationalization, you have the real market participants that ultimately drive, a much more sustained growth. And I think that's how we're thinking about it kind of near term.
Thank you.
Aaron, any other questions?
Yes, there's a question from Lori Bruno. Lori, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Dennis your question?
So Dennis, what information would you need from local chapters in order to work with us regionally? I'm with Northern California ERA.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'm happy to work with anybody regionally. And I know, unfortunately, I was supposed to be in person with you guys last year, and it just so happened to fall on my son's first day of school. So my apologies, and we had to shift to Zoom. You know, reach out. My contact info, you know, I'm on Edgewater is a member of ERA, so I think, you know, I'm assuming as a partner status, Walter, you can find my info on the website. It's also
Yes.
it's also in the slide deck here. You know, Lori, I would love you know, I probably said ad nauseum during this, I would love to be able to carve this level of data down to each individual chapter if we have enough participation.
Right.
If we don't have that level of participation, you know, option B, which is good but not great, you know, I could work with Walter and the team, and we could kind of create quote unquote super regions, if you will. You know, and we could look to that going forward is another way to get it closer, but not as close maybe as ideal. So yeah, if you're looking, especially in this world where we can do Zoom or Teams, you know, I've got to obviously be cognizant of travel, and you know I've talked to some guys today actually about making a Midwestern swing. But you know, if we're looking about getting on the road, and there's a way where I could bucket 3, 4, 5 chapters in 2 days, which is what we're talking about. With the most recent one today, it's you know, hopefully they're not on, they won't be upset. But today we were talking about, you know, how do we potentially do Indianapolis, Minnesota, and Chicago over a day and a half window, fly into Minnesota, do something in breakfast, drive to Chicago, do something at night, spend the night, drive to Indy, do something the next day, fly back to Boston. So a lot of flexibility. If it's kind of quote unquote one-off, I'm also happy to do Zoom, Teams, you name it. So we could find ways to work on it, Laura.
And as Dennis said, the key is get more participation from the Northern Cal chapter, Laura, those companies. And Dennis will have a good cross-section of data.
Yeah,
That will help.
100%.
Yeah.
Do we, are we able to find out how many participants in NorCal are participating? I mean, not by name, but like number, are there 3?
We could get you that information offline.
Yeah, why don't you do
Yeah.
that, and then I
Right.
can work my magic out here.
Right.
Yeah, and you know, that's, you know, Walter and I and Aaron and Claire, we've talked a little bit about this as we were rolling it out, and especially for those who may be in chapter leadership in this call. You know, part of the challenge admittedly is, and that's why I wanted to show what the email looks like, the crazy email address that unfortunately there's no other way that we could do it. You know, help from the chapter leadership to create awareness. I know every time I'm on a Zoom, Teams, phone call, I flat out ask, have you looked at the survey? Are you doing it? That same message from chapter, you know, regional chapter level leadership, I think would help grow. And now I also want to, the participation rate, we do these for several other different trade associations. ERA does have the highest participation rate. So I don't want to come off sounding like Captain Sour Grapes here. There's a lot of pride and kudos to everybody. You know, kudos to everybody on the call. But again, I just, you know, especially when, you know, and I can't remember the number, Walter, you would know the exact number, but off the top of my head, 17 different chapters, maybe of the ERA, maybe 20. We've got really, really regional chapters, which, you know, I use the example, I would hesitate to do it with Lori, just your organization. Say, I don't think it's fair to you guys to effectively be broadcasting your results to everybody. 1 and 2, well, you guys are great. I also wouldn't feel comfortable saying that's the whole market. So there's a protection angle to that as well.
So members can see the results of the survey on the ERA website. And if you have any questions, I know there's a particular spot. I've asked Claire to send the link out to where that is on the ERA website, but only members can see it. You'll need Oh, there's Erin. Erin just posted it. You'll be able to see the results of the survey on the ERA website, but you need to be a member of ERA to access those results. Any other questions on the survey on the chat room, Erin?
No.
Okay, I guess Janice, we've got 3 minutes left, and I know you're not an economist, if you will, or a forecaster or a Nostradamus. I guess you are a Nostradamus. But if I'm sitting there and I'm getting ready to present my budget to Bruce Scoggin tomorrow, and he asked me the question, okay, should I make investments in 2024? Should I hire more people, build a new factory, buy new computers? Should I sort of stand pat for the first half of the year, whatever, or should I look at really counting my nickels and just hold firm? What advice? Grow, stand pass, or maybe look at some expense consolidation?
No, great question, Walter. And I would, in the most simplest, I would tell you it depends on where you're looking to allocate those resources. And you touched on a few of those. I think when you're looking at investing in your people or potentially bringing additional people on, I think now is the time to look. Unfortunately, you have seen, while this is a cyclical correction, it is relatively shallow. You've seen people knee jerk, and you've seen what we always do in this industry, where there have been layoffs and things like that. So, I think, there's still wage inflation, and, unemployment's 3.7%. So it's not a recession, but relative to what it's been, I think now is a good time. If you could find people, I wouldn't wait on people. When you go to you use the example, Walter, of factories, I think that's a completely different equation, because it comes down to how you're going to fund it, right? And unfortunately, the risk-free rate of return 18 months ago was nothing, and now it's 6.5%. So the returns you need with kind of that capital deployment on a CapEx side, I think you've got to weigh a little bit more cautiously relative to, what I'll call is maybe operating expense investments or people or talent or things like that. So, dancing around the question a little bit, but I think if you're looking at CapEx driven projects, I would really, I would put the pen to paper pretty aggressively to figure out the return profile you need and the risk versus the return. I think if you're looking at OpEx, and again, somebody very wise in the business told me, in the rep business in particular, told me, fundamentally as reps, we look a lot like a bank, all in all, right? We've got to pay our people, we sell these deals, and we have to wait for the commission check to come in. So I am not advocating getting upside down, because that's obviously how you can destroy a rep organization. But with that being said, I think when you look at, the number one, I think, my memory serves me right from February, March of this year down in Austin. One of the key things that kept, most people, Mike Swenson ran the, what keeps you up at night panel. And a lot of that was hiring, and there were a lot of breakout sessions on how do we bring people in? How do we train people? The world's different now than it was in February, and there are more people available. Yes, it's going to be competitive, especially for your best in class people, but I wouldn't shy away from the people. I'd probably be more prudent, if you will, with kind of pure CapEx driven deployments.
Perfect. Well, we are at the hour. Those of you Dennis is fascinating with the data and how he interprets it. He will be appearing live at the ERA conference in February. I know it's sold out, and we've got a big waiting list. But Dennis, as always, thank you very much. You've added a lot of insight. Hopefully, our attendees have learned from you and helped them guide them in 2024. I'm going to turn it back over to Aaron Collins, but let me wish all of you happy holidays, and we'll look forward to chatting again in the new year. Ms. Collins, take us home.
All right. Thank you, Walter. And thank you, Dennis, for taking the time to share your insights with us today. This session was recorded, so we'll be posting a link to the recording on the ERA website at era.org under the Online Tools tab. So you're encouraged to share this with your colleagues. The date of our next ERA live session is to be determined, so be on the lookout for additional information. And thanks, everybody, and have a great week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.